To really understand NTP, we need to know some vocabulary. One of those things is UTC. UTC is our mechanism worldwide for coordinating the time so that we're all using the same clock, so to speak, or the same time on the clock, so to speak, even though there are these goofy time zones around the world. Time zones do not make any sense to computers. They're supposed to make humans have an easier time of knowing what time it is so that any place on Earth when it's noon, the sun is approximately overhead. But it gets a little messy when we're talking about computers and daylight savings time and all that stuff. The UTC at midnight in Greenwich, England, right on the prime meridian, or 0 degrees longitude. At midnight, the time is 000. And then around the world, what we do is we coordinate that 000 time, that 0 time at midnight in Greenwich, England. We count forwards or backwards based on the time zone that we're currently in, which brings us to time zones. Time zones are an invention that came about during the advent of passenger trains in the United States. They wanted to make sure that the trains were arriving and leaving on time and that the people that were coming to the train and taking the train were arriving on time to get on and board. The problem was back in the 1800s, it was very hard to coordinate the time because there were no computers or there was no radio and there was no way of communicating long distances to tell anybody what the time actually was. So what ended up happening was each little individual community came up with their own version of time. When the railroads came through these communities, it kind of disrupted everything because the railroads needed a consistent time that they could count on while moving across the country, and they were unable to accommodate all those unique individual times at each individual city. So what we did is we created these time zones. We created 24 of them throughout the world, and they're measured either plus or minus from 000 hours. Some of these time zones have daylight savings time, some of them don't. So the daylight savings time is a ridiculous invention. That's my personal opinion. You can take it how you wish. Daylight savings time is a giant mess in computers because we decide at some moment that on one day we're going to call noon at this time, and on the next day we're going to say that noon is an hour earlier or an hour later, depending upon when it is. So daylight savings time causes all kinds of issues with our logging messages and whatnot because we have to adjust our clock periodically throughout the year. There's other places on Earth, specifically in India, where our time zone is actually not a full hour off, it's actually 30 minutes off. So our plus and minus isn't actually going to be a whole number, it's actually going to be half of an hour instead of a full hour. Now, we've talked about how we call this universal time, the time that's measured at the prime meridian. We talked about the time zones. As we get further away from the prime meridian, we adjust our time by adding hours or subtracting hours from the prime meridian time, or UTC. Talked about daylight savings time. Now let's talk about the stratum. Now the stratum is part of network time protocol. And what the stratum is referring to is it's an NTP server designation. 0 is the stratum given to a server that is closest to the actual time, meaning that the stratum 0 NTP server acquired its time from an atomic clock someplace out in the world. As we move further and further away from that stratum 0 time clock, we go to stratum 1, which is one step away from a stratum 0 server, meaning that a stratum 1 server learned its time from a stratum 0. We have a stratum 2 server, which learned its time from a stratum 1 server. 0 servers are closest to the actual time. We can do all kinds of trickery with stratum 1 and stratum 2 servers to get very accurate measurements of time for the purposes of our needs, especially in a network where we just are recording the time of a log message. We usually don't need to get ridiculously specific to 10 decimal places of what time it is. Usually we just need to get it within a second or so of the time, and we're in really good shape. And then when we report those messages to our logging server, they're all reporting at the same time within about a second or even a half a second. Typically with network time protocol, we can get our devices to have very accurate time across our entire network. What this is, it's a list of all of the UTC time offsets around the world. If we look, right there in the middle is 0. That's at the prime meridian, or 0 degrees longitude, which runs right through Greenwich, England. If you ever get an opportunity to travel to Greenwich, I highly recommend it. You can stand right there on the prime meridian and be in the western hemisphere with one foot and the eastern hemisphere with the other foot. They have a really cool museum there that shows all about time and the development of measurement of time, as well as getting to hang out in the area where Sir Edmund Halley, who discovered Halley's Comet, Newton, and other great scientists hung out there. There's also a really great naval museum in Greenwich, England. I highly recommend traveling there if you ever get a chance or you're nearby. Anyway, enough of that digression. What this chart is showing us is that as we go to the west of the prime meridian, we're subtracting numbers from UTC. So I'm located right here in Madison, Wisconsin, which is very near to Chicago, which means that I am in this -6 time zone. The time zone I'm in here is Central Standard Time. Depending upon where you are in the world, you'll have to look up and adjust your time accordingly. If you look down in India here, you probably can't see it, but it says +5.5 hours. India is a half hour off of the rest of the world, as are several other parts of the world. So this chart will help you find your time zone, which we're going to need. I'm going to configure my time zone for the Central Time, which is where I'm located. So we're going to be using that -6 number to configure it.